This is Andre from Atlanta, Georgia, August 18, 2023. Some parents have a hard time letting go of their children, and that is understandable. It's difficult to watch them grow, I guess. But some parents simply refuse to let them grow up, and that translates into unconscionable behaviors and outcomes. They meddle in their development, they meddle in their life, in our social relations, until they ruin everything. And when I look back, I realized I was raised more like a sentient pet than like a human being. My parents were something else. When I was young, a child, hostility was all I knew. There was so much anger and hostility in them when they were interacting with me. All that changed, became hidden after a certain age, and I think a lot of my life has to do with a piece of real estate. Yeah, so here's what happened. Like I said, my parents meddled with my life and did everything they could to halt my development as a child, but were careful in preserving appearances, like abusers usually are. What you see behind closed doors, all that horror, and what people see when they come in as guests or outside, when you go outside in society, well, those are two different experiences. One of the things one of the dimensions my parents harmed was identity, who I am. And it started early. When I was a toddler, they would call me by the feminine version of my name. Romania is a gendered language. So we have Andrei for boys and Andrea for girls. And they would dress me as a girl and call me Andrea in the house. At one point, they did that publicly. They did that during a Christmas event. And there are pictures from that event with me wearing a skirt. And I grew up with that picture around, with my parents treating it like a good joke. But it wasn't. It wasn't good, and it wasn't a joke. They were actively brainwashing me out of my gender identity. And when my grandparents, especially my grandma from my mother's side, well, they a lot of things were wrong with what my parents were doing, but when the relatives found out and realized, they were really turned off by it, and this is why it stopped. Plus, it wasn't going anywhere. I was never confused about being a boy. The fact that they failed is claimed by my parents as evidence for lack of malintent. See, if we really wanted that, and that usually comes with an insinuated threat. So yeah, my childhood was violent. My parents' relation was violent. My father was violent towards both me and my mom, and my mother was the victim, was on the receiving end from my dad, and me from both. And that had a few effects on me. One of them was the fact that I never saw my mother coming, ever. because I grew up looking at her as a victim, which she was. I It did not occur to me that she may be an aggressor, so it was easy for her to hide herself from me. So in my first years, I spent most time with at my grandparents' house. My mother didn't want anything to do with me. I was used mainly as a shield when my dad would become violent. Then my parents eventually got a divorce. Then the revolution came. I was born in 1980, so I was about 10 years old, maybe, somewhere there, when a few things happened. So revolution came, and with it came the opportunity to buy the apartment in which a person lived. Because before then, in communism, everyone would rent from the state. My parents couldn't afford, my mother and her second husband couldn't afford to buy the apartment, and my grandmother gave them the money. But she said, but she didn't give them the money. She bought the apartment in my name, mine and my sister's, with the condition that my mom and her husband have the right to live there. Now you have to understand, I grew up feeling that that apartment belongs to my mother. I never wielded that in any way, shape, or form. And the narrative around it, my mother told me, was that my grandma decided to do that because she was afraid that her second husband will try to take our house away, our home away. I don't think that was the case. Now looking back, I think my grandmother was afraid that my mother will not keep me, or that she will hurt me, to get rid of me. That my mother really, really didn't want me. And that was my grandmother's way to keep me safe, to get my mother interested in my well-being, at least in my physical, immediate well-being. Keep me away from immediate harm. Keep me safe from immediate harm. Time passed, and fast forward 15 years in 2005. I was completely unaware and unsuspecting of anything. In 2005, a few things have happened that kind of sealed my fate. My grandmother died of a stroke. And a few months later, my mother divorced from her second husband. Then my grandmother died of a stroke. Then a few months later, my mother guilted me into donating her the apartment, and I remained completely helpless and with nothing in this world. My grandma's shield, I just gave it away to my abuser. And I was accepted in a PhD program in psychology in the United States at Emory University. So I left for my first year of graduate studies with Professor Philip Wolf. Hi, Phil. Little did I know, my parents got there before me. See, I received a couple of offers, one of them from Arizona State. And there was what happened, I know now, 17 years, 18 years after first landing in the US. Only now I realize that my parents got somehow people from Emory University, from the psych department, to make me an offer better than anything else I received. But a fake offer. to make me an offer, get me there, and then get me somehow to quit. Abuse me, harass me, create a situation, make it so that I quit. Hijacking my life, essentially. I didn't know that at the time. My first year, the year I spent working with Phil Wolf, was not okay. And after 9 months, I was taking a leave of absence. 8 months in the program, I was taking a leave of absence. And something tells me that I was supposed to stop there, look at myself as a failure, and just resign. But a year later, I returned and I studied after that for 6 years with Jack McDowell. And those years, I thrived. Man, I did so well. And I actually broke free. I became a scholar, a good one. But then I realized that none of that was real. They brought me back. They allowed me to come back from my leave of absence, being perfectly aware that they will never give me credit for anything and they will never recognize that I am their alumni, not to the world. That's what makes this back and forth of mine between Romania and US a case of human trafficking. Because the American side, Emory side, psychology department from Emory, they never actually intended to give me what they promised. And it took me until very recently to realize what they have done and how they have undermined my professional life beginning in grad school. And now here we are,